I planted those hedges myself. I want to start there because the hedges were not a landscape feature I had inherited or purchased along with the house. They were something I had put in the ground with my own hands over the course of 2 weekends in the spring of my second year in the neighborhood, and over the following 6 years I had maintained them, trimmed them, fed them, and watched them grow from 4-foot whips into an 8-foot screen of dense, dark green Thuya green giant that provided the privacy along my rear fence line that I had specifically purchased that house to have. Privacy is not an abstraction to me. I am a woman who works from home, who has a home office that faces the rear yard, and who has made deliberate choices about where to live and how to configure her property specifically so that the space I occupy during my working day is quiet, contained, and unobserved. The hedges were part of that configuration. They were also at 8 feet and 6 years of established growth, genuinely beautiful, the kind of dense, vigorous, healthy planting that a landscape professional would look at and nod at approvingly, which I know because my neighbor across the back fence, a man named Gerald Park, who had been a landscape contractor for 30 years before retiring, had said exactly that to me 2 years before the day I came home and found them gone. Gone. Not trimmed, not cut back. Gone. Every plant in the hedgerow, 22 Thuya green giants planted at 4-foot spacing along 88 feet of rear fence line, had been cut at ground level and removed. The stumps were still there, flush with the soil, each one a clean flat circle of pale wood surrounded by a small depression where the root ball had been pulled. The fence behind where the hedges had stood was suddenly, completely visible, and through it my yard was visible to the property behind mine, and through that visibility my rear patio and my office, window, and the entirety of the private space I had built were visible, in the full afternoon light of a Wednesday in June, to anyone who cared to look. My name is Nora Kelsey. I am 46 years old. I am a freelance technical writer and documentation specialist. I write user manuals, API documentation, software onboarding guides, and anything else that requires translating complex technical material into language that ordinary human beings can understand and follow. I have been doing this for 18 years, entirely from home, in successive home offices that I configure with great care because my working environment is my only working environment, and its quality directly affects my output. I am good at my work. I am also, as a consequence of spending 18 years writing documents that need to be precise, unambiguous, and complete, extremely attentive to what written instruments say and do not say. I live in Westhaven Commons, a 54-home HOA development in Williamson County, Tennessee. I have lived there 8 years. The development is pleasant, good street trees, consistent maintenance, a community pool that I used regularly in the first few years before I got busier. The HOA had been professionally managed and procedurally sound for most of my time there, with the specific exception of the past 2 years, during which a woman named Bethany Rourke had been serving as the Architectural Review Committee chair. Bethany lived 3 houses down, was in her mid-50s, and had a specific conviction about what hedges represented in a residential neighborhood. She believed they were barriers, physical expressions of antisocial withdrawal from community life, and she had made this position clear at multiple HOA meetings in her first year as committee chair, proposing and failing to achieve a revision to the architectural guidelines that would have restricted hedge planting to a maximum height of 4 feet. The 4-foot maximum had not been adopted because 3 other homeowners had spoken against it at the meeting where it was proposed, and because the HOA's own attorney had noted that retroactively restricting existing compliant plantings raised fairness questions the board did not want to invite. Bethany's hedge proposal had been my first indication that she had opinions about my specific property. My hedges were 8 feet tall at the time of the meeting, fully compliant with the existing guidelines, and were mentioned by name in her presentation as an example of the hedging that she found architecturally inconsistent with the development's character. I had attended that meeting. I had not spoken during it because my hedges were compliant and the proposal did not pass, and I had assessed that speaking was unnecessary. I should have spoken. The second indication was a compliance inspection notice I received in April of the following year. The notice said my hedges had been observed to have some dead material in the lower sections that constituted a maintenance concern under the Community Standards General Appearance provisions. I went outside and looked at my hedges carefully. There was one small section, approximately 3 feet long near the north end, where a single branch had browned, one branch, on one plant. Out of 22 plants at 88 feet, I removed the dead branch, photographed the hedges from multiple angles showing their overall healthy condition, and sent the photographs to the HOA management company with a written response noting that the cited material had been removed and the planting was otherwise in excellent condition. The management company acknowledged my response and closed the compliance item. Bethany, who I learned from a neighbor had been the source of the inspection report, did not comment further at the time. The third indication was in May of the year this story takes place, when Bethany stopped me on the sidewalk during a morning walk and said she wanted to talk about my hedges. I said, "Go ahead." She said she was concerned that the height of the hedges was affecting the drainage in her rear yard. She lived 2 properties south of me on the same street and did not back up to my hedge row at all, which made this claim geographically confusing. I said I was not sure how hedges on my rear property line could affect drainage at her property 2 lots away. She said it was a matter of wind patterns and soil moisture. I said I was not aware that wind patterns affecting soil moisture was a provision of the community standards. She said she was going to bring it to the board. I said that was her prerogative. I finished my walk. She brought it to the board. The board declined to take action, noting that the claim was speculative and that my hedges were in compliance with the applicable standards. On the Wednesday in June, when I came home at 3 in the afternoon from a client meeting in Nashville and found my hedge row cut to the ground, I had 3 of these prior incidents documented in writing. I also had the photographic evidence of my initial planting, the maintenance records, the compliance inspection response, and the photographs I had taken the previous Saturday showing the hedges in their full, healthy, established condition. I stood in my rear yard for approximately 5 minutes looking at the stumps. Then I took photographs, many, careful, systematic, covering every stump and the full fence line. Then I went inside and called my HOA management company. The coordinator who answered, a woman named Michelle, said she would look into it. She called me back 40 minutes later and said she had contacted the West Haven Commons HOA board and that the board had authorized an emergency landscape work order for the removal of vegetation that had been cited in a compliance matter. She said the work had been carried out by the HOA's contracted landscape service that afternoon. I said, "Michelle, which compliance matter authorized the removal of established compliant landscaping?" She said she was looking at the work order and it referenced compliance notices related to dead material and ongoing maintenance concerns. I said, "Michelle, the compliance notice from April was closed. There were no open compliance matters on my property." She said she would need to review the file more carefully and would call me back. She did not call me back that day. I spent the evening documenting everything in writing. I wrote a chronological account of every relevant interaction, the hedge height proposal at the board meeting, the April compliance notice and my response, the May sidewalk conversation, and the June removal. I noted dates, times, names, and the specific content of each communication. I found and printed every written exchange. I had 22 Thuya green giants purchased at a specific nursery at a specific price in a specific year, and I had the receipt because I keep receipts. I had the photographs. I had the closed compliance notice. I had the management company's acknowledgement of the closure. I did not have anyone's authorization for the removal of 22 trees that were growing on my property in compliance with every applicable standard. I called a property attorney the following morning. Her name was Christine Aldrich, and she had been recommended to me by a colleague who had used her for a residential matter 2 years earlier. I described the situation in the specific, organized, document-referenced way that I describe everything after 18 years of writing technical documents, which meant Christine had an entirely clear picture of the situation within about 12 minutes of the call. She said, "Nora, they removed your trees without authorization." I said, "Yes." She said, "The work order does not cure the unauthorized removal. A work order is an internal document. The question is whether the HOA had any basis to authorize the removal of compliant landscaping on private property. I said I did not believe they had. She said, I don't believe they did either. The closed compliance notice is particularly important. It establishes that the prior cited condition had been addressed and there was no open violation. She said, I'm going to send a demand letter to the HOA board and the management company today. What are you seeking? I said I wanted replacement trees of equivalent size and maturity, the cost of installation, and a formal acknowledgement that the removal was unauthorized. She said, Thuya green giant at 8 feet established size is not cheap. I said no, it was not. I had researched the replacement cost the night before, because that is the kind of thing I do. 22 Thuya green giants at 7 to 8 feet, balled and burlapped from a commercial nursery, ran approximately $220 to $250 each, not including installation. Installation for 22 trees at appropriate spacing along 88 feet of fence line, including soil preparation and initial watering, would run somewhere between $1,400 and $1,800 from a reputable landscape contractor. Total replacement cost, approximately $6,600 to $7,300. Christine's demand letter went out that day. I did not see it drafted because Christine sent it directly, but she told me the substance. The unauthorized removal of 22 trees constituting private property on my residential lot, the absence of any valid open compliance basis for the removal, the demand for full replacement at equivalent size and maturity, the installation cost, and Christine's fees for the demand letter with a 30-day response deadline. Michelle called me the following morning and said the board was reviewing the matter and would be in touch. She sounded, for the first time in our interactions, genuinely uncertain. Bethany Rourke knocked on my door that Saturday morning. I opened the door. She was wearing the expression of someone who had prepared a speech and was now executing it. She said she wanted to explain that the compliance work had been necessary because the Hedges had posed an ongoing concern under the community standards, and that she hoped I understood the decision had been made in the community's best interests. I said, Bethany, the compliance notice was closed in April. There were no open compliance matters on my property. He said the closure of the individual notice did not preclude a broader concern being addressed. I said, what broader concern? She said, the ongoing height issue and the aesthetic inconsistency with community character. I said, the height issue was a proposal you made to change the guidelines. The proposal did not pass. My hedges were compliant with the guidelines as adopted. She said, I felt the board needed to take a more proactive approach. I said, did the board authorize this removal? She was quiet for a moment. She said the committee had authority to initiate compliance work. I said, under which provision? She said she would need to check. I said, Bethany, my attorney has sent a demand letter. I'd suggest you direct any further communication through the HOA's attorney. I closed the door. I called Christine and told her about the Saturday visit. She said, Nora, don't speak to her again about this. If she comes back, tell her to contact me. I said I had already effectively done that. She said good. The HOA's attorney, a man named Ted Garland, who I subsequently looked up and confirmed practiced general HOA law in Williamson County, responded to Christine's demand letter on the last day of the 30-day deadline. His response did not acknowledge the removal as unauthorized. It said the board was conducting an internal review of the compliance documentation and that they would respond more fully when that review was complete. It asked for an extension of the response period. Christine said to me when she called, Ted's buying time. They're trying to find something that justifies the removal. I said there was nothing to find because there was nothing there. She said, I know, but they need to see the end of their own search before they'll accept that. She said, I'm granting a 15-day extension, not 30. I'm also sending them a preservation notice for all compliance-related documents, communications, and work orders. If something gets lost or altered during their review, I said, that becomes its own problem for them. She said, exactly. 15 days later, Ted Garland's follow-up letter arrived. It said the board had reviewed the matter and determined that the removal had been authorized under the committee chair's interpretation of the maintenance compliance provision, and that the HOA's position was that no violation of my property rights had occurred. Christine called me after she read it. She said, "Nora, they're going to litigation. You want to go?" I said yes. She said, "The claim is conversion, unauthorized taking of personal property, and trespass. We have strong documentation. We have the closed compliance notice. We have your photographs. We have the work order referencing a non-existent open matter." She said, "We're also going to name Bethany Rourke individually as the directing party." I said, "Is that appropriate?" She said if she directed this removal without board authorization, she acted in her individual capacity and is individually liable. If she had board authorization, the board is liable and her role goes to the board's exposure. She said, either way, naming her individually focuses the matter appropriately. She said, "There's one more thing I want to do before we file." I said, "What?" She said, "I want to send the board a final demand that includes a specific settlement proposal, because once we file there's no settlement without litigation costs on both sides." I said, "Let's send it." The final demand proposed the following: replacement of all 22 trees at equivalent size, professional installation by a contractor I approved, a formal written acknowledgement from the board that the removal had exceeded the committee's authority, and reimbursement of Christine's fees to date. Total, approximately $9,000. Christine said in the letter that if the board chose not to respond constructively within 10 days, we would file in Williamson County Circuit Court and seek the replacement costs plus treble damages under Tennessee's trespass statute, plus attorney fees. I spent those 10 days doing something else. I had been thinking about it since the afternoon I stood in my rear yard looking at the stumps, and the thinking had produced a plan that I wanted to execute regardless of how the settlement demand resolved, because the settlement demand addressed what had happened, and the plan addressed what would happen next. I was going to build a wall. I want to explain why I chose a wall rather than replacement hedges, and why I chose the specific wall I chose, because the choice was deliberate, and the deliberateness matters to the story. I could have replanted. Christine's demand specifically requested replacement trees, and if the settlement produced them, I would have had my hedge row back in 3 to 5 years at the size it had taken 6 years to reach. That would have been a resolution. It would have put me back where I was, more or less, and I could have continued my working life with my rear yard private and contained, and the stumps gradually rotting into the soil. But here is what I thought about in those 10 days. The hedges were gone because someone had decided that her opinion about the appropriateness of privacy screening on my property had authority over my property rights, and that authority had been unchallenged long enough that she had acted on it. Replanting hedges meant trusting that the same person would not act the same way again, or that the consequences I was pursuing would be sufficient deterrent. I did not have confidence in either of those things. Bethany Rourke had pursued my hedges through a failed guideline proposal, a manufactured compliance notice, an unfounded drainage complaint, and finally, an unauthorized removal. A person with that persistence and that conviction would not be deterred by a legal settlement that involved no personal consequence to her. The HOA's insurance or reserves would cover whatever was paid, and Bethany would still be on the Architectural Review Committee. What would deter Bethany, and what would protect whatever I put in the ground next, was something she could not cut down, something that was not vegetation, not subject to any complaint about dead branches or height guidelines or drainage impacts. Something made of material that did not die, did not grow beyond permitted dimensions, and could not be cited for maintenance concerns because its maintenance requirement was essentially zero. The Westhaven Commons HOA covenants had a fence provision. The fence provision permitted privacy fencing along rear and side yard boundaries in specific materials, wood, vinyl, aluminum, or wrought iron, not to exceed 6 feet in height. The fence provision did not say anything about masonry walls. It did not permit them, but it did not prohibit them either, and the language I had now read 17 times used the phrase privacy fencing specifically, which meant the provision applied to fencing and not to structural masonry walls, which were a different category of boundary feature entirely under the general construction provisions. The general construction provisions allowed permanent improvements to rear yard boundary areas subject to architectural committee review for structures above a certain threshold, specifically structures that required a building permit. I checked the Williamson County building permit requirements. A masonry wall under 6 feet in height and under a certain linear footage did not require a permit. My rear boundary was 88 feet. The threshold was 100 linear feet. I was under it. No permit required. The fence provision capped privacy fencing at 6 feet. My proposed masonry wall would be 6 feet. Exactly 6 feet, measured from grade, clean cap course on top. I called a masonry contractor named Robert Ellison, who had been recommended to me by my neighbor Gerald Park, the retired landscape contractor. Gerald had done work with Robert on several commercial projects and said Robert ran a clean operation and did good work. I described what I wanted: a concrete masonry unit wall, 6 feet tall, running the full 88-foot rear boundary, stucco finish on the exterior face, painted a warm neutral consistent with my house's exterior palette, cap block on top, footed properly on a strip footing. Robert came out and walked the boundary and said he could have a proposal to me within the week. He sent it in 4 days. The proposal was $14,800, which was more than the hedge replacement value, but which was, in the specific calculus of what I was building and why, exactly worth it. I also sent the architectural committee a notification of the planned improvement, consistent with the general construction provisions I had reviewed. The notification described the structure, its dimensions, its materials, and its position on my rear property line. I sent it the same day I received Robert's proposal. I sent it to the committee and to the HOA management company by certified mail and email. The response I received 3 days later was from Bethany Rourke, as committee chair. The response said the committee was denying my notification because the proposed structure was inconsistent with the development's aesthetic character and exceeded what the committee considered appropriate for a residential rear yard boundary. I sent the response to Christine immediately. Christine said, "Nora, the notification provision is for structures that require architectural approval. Let me reread your documents." She called back 30 minutes later and said, "The general construction provision requires notification and approval for structures above threshold defined as permit required. Your wall doesn't require permit. It's below the threshold. The notification provision doesn't apply." She said the committee's denial is a nullity. They're denying something they don't have authority to deny. I said, "Should I proceed?" She said, "What does the provision say about non-permit structures?" I read it to her. She said, "The provision says permit-required structures require architectural approval. It says nothing about non-permit structures. The committee has no approval authority over a non-permit structure." She said, "Nora, build your wall." I called Robert Ellison and told him to schedule the build. Robert and his crew began on a Monday morning 2 weeks later. 3 men with a concrete mixer, a skid steer for moving block pallets, and the organized efficiency of people who have built CMU walls many times before. They laid the footing strip on Monday, dug, formed, poured, and left to cure. Tuesday they were back and laid the first 4 courses. By Thursday the wall was at 5 courses. Friday morning they laid the final course and the cap block and cleaned the joints. The wall went up in 5 days. I was in my home office for most of the build, which meant I could look out my rear window and watch the wall grow course by course over the course of the week. On Friday afternoon, when Robert's crew was finishing the cleanup, I walked the full length of the rear boundary and looked at what had been built. It was 6 feet of solid CMU, properly footed, properly jointed, cap course level and clean. The exterior face, the face that was visible to whoever owned the property behind mine, was smooth and even and waiting for the stucco coat that Robert's team applied the following Monday. The interior face, my side, was natural block, which I had chosen deliberately because I wanted the interior face to feel like what it was: structural, honest, substantial. I knocked on the cap block with my knuckles. It sounded like something that was not going anywhere. Gerald Park came over Friday afternoon when the crew was finishing and stood beside me looking at the wall. He said, "Nora." I said, "Yes." He said, "You know what this is?" I said, "A 6-foot CMU wall." He said, "This is what the end of the hedge argument looks like." I said, "I thought so too." He said, "She can't cite it for dead material." I said, "No." He said, "Can't say it's too tall." I said no. He said, can't do anything to it with a saw. I said definitely not. He said, how's the settlement going? I said there was a response due in 3 days on Christine's final demand. The response arrived on the deadline date. The HOA's attorney Ted Garland had apparently assessed the litigation exposure carefully because his letter was considerably different from the prior one that had defended the removal as authorized. This letter said the board had completed its review and had determined that the compliance removal had not followed the proper procedural steps required for work on private property and that the board was prepared to make the situation right. The board proposed professional installation of 22 replacement Thuya green giants at 6 feet bald and burlapped, not the 8 feet I had originally demanded, but 6 feet, which was the maximum size the certified nursery Ted referenced could provide on the project timeline, plus installation costs, plus Christine's fees. Total, approximately $8,400. I called Christine. She said, Nora, this is a real offer. It's not the full amount. The trees are 2 feet shorter than your originals were, but they're the same species and variety, and in 6 years they'll be at the same height yours were. I said, do I need the replacement trees if I have the wall? She said, the wall doesn't give you the legal remedy. The settlement does. The settlement also creates the formal acknowledgement of unauthorized removal that you can use if Bethany does anything like this again. I said, is there language in the offer about Bethany specifically? She said, no, that's something I want to negotiate. She called Ted back and asked whether the settlement could include a provision that Bethany recuse herself from any future compliance matters related to my property. Ted came back the following day and said the board would agree to a provision requiring recusal. The settlement agreement included the following: replacement trees as described, installation by a contractor I approved, Christine's fees, and a recusal provision requiring that any future compliance matter related to my property be reviewed by a board member other than the Architectural Review Committee chair, with the committee chair's role limited to administrative processing rather than determination. The agreement was signed by both parties and a copy was filed in my records and with the HOA management company. Robert's team applied the stucco to the wall the Monday after the settlement was signed. The warm, neutral color I had chosen, a sand tone that Christine had admired when I showed her the sample chip, went on in 2 coats over 2 days and dried to the clean, even finish that properly applied stucco produces when the work is done correctly. The wall looked, from the street, like a wall that had always been there. It looked from my rear yard like a wall that was going to be there for a very long time. Replacement trees arrived 4 weeks later, installed by a landscape contractor I had selected from 3 bids. They went in along the interior face of the wall, the CMU side, rather than on the fence line where the originals had been, which meant they would grow against the wall's solid backing and would in 6 years produce the same 8-foot privacy screen the originals had provided, now with a wall behind them that would still be standing regardless of what anyone decided about the trees. Bethany Rourke remained on the Architectural Review Committee. She was still committee chair as of the most recent HOA meeting I attended, because the board had no mechanism for removing her from the position short of a vote. She had not given them occasion to take after the settlement. What she did not have was authority over my property's compliance matters, which now went to William Gaines, a board member who had been on the board for 4 years, and who had the specific quality of someone who read documents carefully before acting on them, which was all I had ever wanted from anyone in a position of authority over matters affecting my property. My rear yard is private. My office window looks out at a wall and increasingly at the lower sections of the replacement trees filling in the foreground. The wall absorbs the afternoon sun and radiates it back into the yard in the early evening in a way that the hedges never did, and I have found that I like this. The warmth that stone holds and gives back is a specific thing that you do not get from a row of trees, and that has become part of the yard's particular character in a way I had not anticipated. Gerald Park told me, the fall after the wall went up, that Thuya green giant in good soil with appropriate watering gains 3 to 5 feet per year in the first several years of establishment. He said, Nora, in 5 years those trees are going to top that wall. I said, good. He said, And there will still be a wall. I said, yes, there will still be a wall. He laughed, a short, specific laugh that said he understood exactly what I meant. He was a landscape contractor for 30 years. He understood what it meant to grow something properly and to build something under it to make sure it would not be taken again. That was what I had built, not just a wall. The thing under the thing, the foundation that would remain when the planting above it was full and blocking every sight line, and no one could see through or around it. In a few more years, you will not see the wall from my yard. You will see trees. The wall will be behind the trees, invisible, undisturbed, doing what walls do when they are properly made, which is to remain. I knocked on it last week when I was checking the irrigation on the new planting. Same sound it made on the day Robert's crew finished. Solid, complete, not going anywhere. It never will.